Professor William Gumede says the breakdown in the rule of law, uncontrolled corruption, and the collapse of public service delivery have undermined the authority of the state in all three spheres of government. He says the state, army, and intelligence services operate outside the law, and elements of the police are found to be corrupt, breaking laws, and using violence against citizens. Now, the views of Professor William Gumede, who in his observation also asserts that the concept of gated communities, where residents form their own private but legally self-sufficient states to provide public services, is part of the phenomena. Very interesting assertions. That's why we have invited Professor William Gumede, who is an associate professor at the Wits School of Governance, to join us and discuss this further. Professor, great to have you. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Looking forward to this conversation. So let's just have a look at some things that you've said. You say the breakdown in the rule of law, the uncontrolled corruption, and the collapse of public service delivery, elements of vigilantism, so in short, basically saying that South Africa looks like a country that's gone rogue. Is this what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I'm saying is, so the authority of the state has been eroded. So if you want to do all of these, covert economic restructuring that we all want as a society, but we have a state that doesn't have the confidence of large numbers of people or the authority or the credibility, it is very difficult to do these things. And that is why it is important that, that the state regains its authority and its legitimacy, but it can only do it not through force, of course, but through cleaning up corruption and through increasing the efficiency of the state and to deal with law and order, but to deal with law and order in a way that makes sense. Now, what makes sense? To tackle those people who are politically connected and those who are untouchable, whether it is gangsters or taxi drivers, or whether it is your senior business or politicians, to tackle them also, not just ordinary citizens with no power.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to how this all began. I mean, you say that the breakdown is in every sphere of government and possibly of society as well. What has brought state incapacity and inertia? Where did this all begin?
Unfortunately, the credibility of any state, not only in South Africa, but anywhere else, is always bound up to whether the state, is effective, number one, whether the state is fair, and whether the state delivered to all people equally. So unfortunately, we've seen a breakdown at all of these levels, of the South African state. Now, the last couple of years, we have seen, sadly, a decline, in the South African state, almost to a decline that we've seen this, in other countries like Argentina. Now, Argentina, in the 1920s, 1930s, was an industrial country, really. And then after the Second World War, because of poor governance and because of corruption, because of inefficiency in service delivery, have declined, quite dramatically, of all of the years since the Second World War. Now, unfortunately, this has been the situation in South Africa for the last decades or so. But if we don't change the status quo, if we don't restore law and order in the country, we actually may get worse than Argentina. So there are two possible examples of getting worse than, the Argentina example. There is the example, for example, of Lebanon that we've seen very recently, with many citizens, over a very long time protested against corruption and poor service delivery until, they eventually pushed out the government, and they had no government thereafter. The other also frightening scenario is what happened, of course, in Bolivia, where at the end of last year, also people pushed out the leader of the country, and he had to flee to another country. And then there's a last potential scenario where, the whole state become lawless, whether it's local government, provincial government, and national governments. And then we almost see a mafia state. And that is important that every citizen in the country, civil society, in the media, that we do a fight to restore law and order in the country, and we tackle corruption, and then we bring accountability back to government.
And this is the reality. It's the accountability. It's also the role of the executive in the arms of state. I mean, let's look at the leadership that we've got from the president. We need to look right at the top in appointing the right people who can actually deliver, and not party deployees. Because we look around and we almost see a void when it comes to leadership, and then these voids are filled with the wrong leadership and the wrong kind of leadership. I mean, this is a very, very difficult balancing act that one needs to follow, because you see somebody, as in the president, who is also putting the party's interests first as opposed to the country, but the country is falling into a state of lawlessness. Where do you begin? What should we do? I mean, should we cause political unrest, take to the streets, burn buildings, and try and get rid of political parties? Or is there another way of doing it from the examples that you've given us?
The very first thing is we have to get, the right people in the right jobs. Now, unfortunately, this has been the post-colonial failure of almost every African country. People often ask me, they ask, why have most African countries failed since the Second World War? The very first question is, not appointing the right people, appointing political party cadres, appointing family members, and so on. So what is happening in the country? Also, at the same time that we have this law and order, the country is being run by a really small clique of people. And whereas we have all of the talent in the country, so almost where we have unused capacity in the country. So the talent is unused capacity that we're not using, but we're using a small group of people without the skills, and whatever plans we're going to come up with, unfortunately, they won't turn around the situation, because we really have to bring everyone in the country who are keen to be involved. That's really where we start. The second thing is we really have to, and there has been a bit of a start to it, deal with corruption. So when I say deal with corruption, go for the people that we know, that society know are corrupt, political leaders, whether they from the governing party or opposition parties. And then in the communities, the people that walk around, gangsters, taxi bosses, and that take the law into their own hands. These are really bad examples for people. Why will other people, ordinary people, follow the law if they just see, taxis just do whatever they want to do, or gangsters just do whatever they want to do? I mean, people assassinate, even, the detective down in Cape Town, leader of the anti-gang unit, and so on. So we really have to do those really almost obvious examples of lawlessness.
I mean, we need to bring in the role of Parliament in all of this and talk about the relevance then of the legislative role of Parliament. One of those is holding government officials to account, but also impeaching those who just don't fulfill their constitutional mandate. We're not seeing this. So let's question, how successful is Parliament in its role?
Unfortunately, one can always make an argument, that part of our Parliament is also lawless. Yeah. It's almost, Parliament's part of it is also failed because of not holding the executive accountable, and state-owned companies accountable, government agencies accountable, the executive accountable. We can almost then conclude that Parliament has also failed in many, many ways. So how do we hold Parliament also accountable? I think the very first thing is we have to deal with corrupt members of Parliament, and then secondly with ineffective members of Parliament. So I think members of their political parties, voted for political parties, when they see the members of Parliament there in Parliament who are corrupt, who are ineffective, they really have to mobilize to have their parties fire these people or, have these people resign. Because at the moment, our electoral system has a weakness, is that ordinary people cannot recall members of parliament who sleep in parliament or who are corrupt and so on. So it's a party leadership that do that. So in this system, unfortunately, it would have to be, the voters, if you have voted for a party and you see a corrupt member of parliament, to go march again to the party head office and demand that that member of parliament be sacked.
Yeah, I also asked you about, there's so much to ask you. I'm going to have to ask you to bring them in so that I can ask you one or two before we say goodbye. How crippling has the proportional representation or PR system been in the running of our government? When we look at the majority of the South African Parliament coming from one party, a ruling party, and voting based on party lines than on personal integrity, is there a problem there?
Absolutely. So our electoral system is not fit for purpose. And we really have to change this if we want to change, the country. So the missing link in our electoral system right now is that it is what we call a closed party list system. It means that members of parliament or elected representatives, candidates are handpicked and appointed by the parties, and the parties don't have to tell their voters and supporters who these members are, and we only see them in parliament. And secondly, the second weakness is that, ordinary citizens cannot recall these ineffective or corrupt members of parliament. Only the party leadership can do that. Now, what has happened is the party leadership, unfortunately, and it's the governing party, but also often opposition parties, handpick sometimes the most incompetent, elected representatives, or some of the most corrupt people in the country sitting in parliament, because they are loyal to the party and to the party line, to the party leadership, and very difficult to get them out. So the system begins there. Then these very incompetent members of parliament appoint CEOs of state-owned companies, board members of state-owned companies, and you can just now see how the system, it is just, from the electoral system downwards, we have a system, ineffective system, corrupt system throughout government. So it really is going to be important where we change the system, the electoral system, to bring in greater accountability and greater say, by ordinary citizens to recall incompetent and corrupt elected representatives.
The other problem as well is just two very quick questions. There's been this argument that the failures of the legislative arm have given the citizens no choice but to go to the courts now. And we see this time and time again, is that the courts seem to be making the decisions that should be made elsewhere.
Absolutely, because, there are two fundamental things wrong with our governance systems, the country's governance system. The one part of it is, of course, the way we elect our elected representatives, that allows incompetent and corrupt people to get into power. The second part of it is, of course, also, it is broken governance at a public service side, the appointments there where, the party can decide to appoint, pliable, loyal, but incompetent cadres and not the best people and the best talent in the country. So, there are two parts of the broken system of our governance, has an impact across the country. So, what has saved us, what has helped us so far, because the situation could have been worse, has been the courts. So the courts actually has been playing that role of that oversight, when people run out of choices, they don't know what to do anymore. Unfortunately, the court is the only place that people can go. And just think about it in the case of the South African Airways, the former chairwoman, the courts declared her delinquent director when she and her group of board members and management ran that airline into the ground. Where was government? Where was parliament? So, failure on both sides. So it leaves the court system and judiciary with no choice but to intervene. And even, we've seen media coverage of corruption, of inefficiency, but there's been no action, until people go to the courts. So really that shows you, the failure of our governance system, both at the elected representative level and also at a public service.
Prof, we're going to have to just put you. Have you got 5 minutes just in after the hour of news?
Yes, I do.
8?
I do.
Because I really want to talk about the crime in South Africa, the farm murders with you, and I also want to talk about how you feel that gated communities, estates, the living way of South Africa is also contributing to why communities are so divided. So I want to get your views on that. I know you have something to say, but we need to quickly take a break so that we can say goodbye to our SABC2 viewers. This conversation will continue on SABC News. Stay with us.